Today's going to be a little bit different. We're not going to be talking about economic theory as such, but a new sector that has absorbed some economic insight that I think the Mises Institute has played a role in making happen. And I think in many ways, Alan Mendendahl, you're here with us. You represent something like a new field of study for the application of Austrian economics. You're studying literature at Auburn University.
That's correct, yeah, and I think that calling Cantor and Cox's work groundbreaking is certainly a fair designation.
I'm going to put this on demonstration here. You know, some background. I think this project goes back some 20 years. It was Paul Cantor was a student of Mises, and he gave the first paper under the encouragement of Murray Rothbard to apply economics to literary criticism. And then he inspired so many others who have written this, put together this book. It was so many years in the making. And now you are pursuing PhD studies in literature.
That's correct.
With an eye towards continuing this project, which is to take the insights of liberalism or free market theory, or the Austrian school in particular, and apply it to literary criticism. And could you explain why would this be necessary? What is it counterbalancing?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that Marxism has become the dominant paradigm among literature scholars working at the intersections of literature and economics. That's not to say that there are scholars working in other areas of economics. What's true of some English professors is not true of all, but nevertheless, the dominant paradigm for those scholars that do use economics and bring economics to bear on literary texts tend to be Marxist, neo-Marxist, maybe a term they would prefer, broadly speaking, left-wing. And I think that capitalism, free market economics, does have a lot to offer to the literary field.
Yeah, well, I think it's just intuitively it's true that once you understand something about free market economics and you read a book of any sort from any time and any place, you see new things in it, like you develop an ear for it. And I suppose it's also true that if you've been trained in a kind of Marxian paradigm, you would read the book through those eyes. But when you say Marxism, you don't mean that professors of literature are pouring through Marx's book Capital or something like that. You mean that they have a kind of a social theory?
Well, that's in some cases yes, and in some cases no. One thing I want to, in the spirit of methodological individualism, I want to try to keep from casting this as a symptom of all humanities scholars or all English departments. Nevertheless, figures like, say, Frederick Jameson, Terry Eagleton, Slavoj Žižek, these figures are using Marxism in a way that is distinguished, at least according to them, from the political or practical Marxism of like a Mao or Lenin, Stalin, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess you would call it more of a theoretical Marxism. And the idea underpinning this variety of Marxism is that the text as a commodity is basically fraught with ideological assumptions that can be exposed through close examination of the text vis-a-vis the culture in which the text was produced.
So to look at the class origins of the writer and how that would bias his telling of a story?
More or less, and writers are not always coming from upper classes, but challenging cultural assumptions, cultural norms that could be linked to what you would broadly call ideology, how a text either supports or in some cases calls into question, but ultimately reflects a certain class conscious, a certain class dominance. It's very much interested in class warfare, although those terms aren't used very often anymore.
But there's a tendency, Ellen, right, to see within any story or within any framework of a piece of literature, the existence of conflict as being the center of the story.
Absolutely,
right?
and sometimes a Marxist reading can get quite carried away, where the conflict in the story is sort of interpreted to reflect enormous class themes and narratives that aren't necessarily there. I think where the Marxists are having most success is in treating text as a literary artifact, as a commodity, which it is, because a book is subject to supply and demand. It is, it does carry a sort of cultural currency, let's say. However, that look at a text doesn't mean that we couldn't flip the analysis on its head and then apply a capitalist or free market perspective on that text and how it gains.
That's how we account for Cantor's emphasis on telling the story about how a novel came to be written and serialized and commercialized, which he celebrates.
That's right, and I think that the commercial culture does do a lot to promote and nourish and cultivate creative energies. Yeah. And I think that's a very important statement to make. I think it would be beneficial to view the writer as an entrepreneur. Harold Bloom has a very famous theory called the anxiety of influence, which is the idea that poets sort of like to revise and extend the forms and the thoughts of poets who came before. And I think that entrepreneurs do the same thing, more or less. And I think that thinking of new ways to channel creative energies is something that we could focus on as literary scholars.
Right. But the Marxism extends also to a way of perceiving a text also. Am I right that there's a kind of deconstructionist assumption that there's no inherent meaning within the story as the author tells it, but rather we always and everywhere bring a certain ideological bias to understanding a story, or that the author brings a certain... But you agree with that, right?
To a certain extent, I do. I mean, I definitely do not think that we are culturally determined, but I do think that we are bound to our historical moment. We are bound to the time and space in which we exist, which means we do... for example, I would be incapable of writing a novel right now that would conform to whatever fashions are there 200 years from now. So to that extent, writers can't necessarily escape their historical
which you hear
moment.
all the time, right? I
right.
mean, this is part of the theme. Well, you can't escape, and you're saying, well, okay, fine, we'll go with that.
Yeah, but I do think, and this is one thing I think that Austrian economics is very important in pointing out, is that a human being is, in praxeological terms, a human being is a rational, autonomous agent who is navigating his or her world in the best way that he or she can, and that includes authors of literature. And just because an author of literature is in some ways involved and immersed in a culture doesn't necessarily mean that they are products of that culture, or that the culture is doing the writing rather than the author.
Right, yeah. So there's a tendency then probably within Austrian literary criticism to celebrate the writer as somebody who's achieved something as an individual.
I think so, and that's I think that's a great idea.
Which may sound intuitive to any normal listener.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's one of the great benefits of Austrian economic thinking and praxeology, is to celebrate the individual and individual achievement and individual accomplishment. And, that doesn't have to be done by necessarily going into Harold Bloom's paradigm of, the romantic genius. The artist doesn't have to be pure genius to negotiate the cultural parameters in which he or she is located. But it's very interesting to see how Authors distinguish themselves, rise above their cultural moment, and are able to produce texts that do sort of transcend historical moments and touch upon perennial themes.
Well, now, Alan, how did you get in contact with Cantor's work? And now you left law, which I guess you were practicing.
That's right.
To pursue a PhD in literary and literature.
That's right.
Tell your own story here.
Sure.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I attended law school at West Virginia University. There are a good number of libertarians working at West Virginia University, so it was a good place to be. I did my master's degree and law degree simultaneously. I went to law school during the day, and I took my master's courses in the evening. And since then, I've gone on, and I'm actually currently pursuing 2 degrees at once. I'm doing an LLM and a law at Temple University, and I'm sort of, flying back and forth and doing some distance work and that sort of thing, and doing the PhD in English at Auburn. So yes, it's a very unusual background, but it is also a background. I should say my legal experiences were very eye-opening to me. The one thing I would credit my legal education for would be, above all, lifting me out of sort of those Marxist paradigms and assumptions and left-wing thinking that I had just sort of taken for granted as an undergraduate, just, sort of an impressionable young kid that would, take everything that his professor said as gospel truth. And certainly an exposure to different ways of thinking and more realistic ways of thinking was important for me in my intellectual development.
And the Austrian paradigm, when did that hit you? When did you come across it?
Well, I should say I came across libertarianism in general before I came across Austrian economics. And that basically hit around my first year of law school. And it's hard for me to pinpoint how it developed or what I first read, but it was a very gradual process. It came in fits and starts, and then I would say became exploded into an outright obsession somehow in my second, third year of law school, around that time.
But to drop law to embrace literature,
yeah,
how did that come about?
That's a very good question. Well, there are a variety of reasons. One is that I do sense that my vocation, as it were, is to teach. I enjoy teaching, and I feel called to teach for various reasons. And I've always been drawn to literature. Since I was a young child, I would, before I could even read, my mom would read stories to me, and then I thought I was able to read because I had memorized the stories and I could recite them from cover to cover, but I wasn't actually able to read. So I've had a love of literature, I guess you say, for quite a long time. And whereas a love of literature won't necessarily sustain graduate study in literature, it is certainly yes, it's certainly the inspiration.
Are you able to specialize in what you love now that you're in doing your PhD work?
For the most part, I do a lot of work at the intersection of law and the humanities. I recently published a paper in Libertarian Papers, actually, on Ian Forster's Passage to India, and I worked with the idea of rule of law being a fiction, building off of John Hausnoss's paper, and then sort of working that idea into some of Rothbard's criticisms of Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism from classical economics. And I basically show how Forster presents Brahmin Hinduism, which is certainly a philosophy or religious teaching that he was not fully familiar with, but his understanding of that philosophy to sort of disrupt notions of rule of law, which is almost always an excuse for increased government control, increased bureaucracy, any sort of legitimizing of imperial ventures and these sorts of things. And I should bring up, I appreciated your article this week in Mises Daily, the article on big business in particular. I noticed that you referenced the East India Company, and there's
as an example, right?
Exactly. There's a loaded history there, and Forster's coming way at the end of that, but the history certainly there in the text. So,
well, as you're talking, I'm realizing that there's almost an infinite amount of work to do in this sector, right? I mean,
That's
as much
true.
literature as there is.
That's very true.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be tougher to say, okay, I'm going to take the boom bust cycle and figure out how to fit these literary texts into that. That's tougher to do, but I think Cantor and Cox, say spontaneous order. Yeah. I think they show how texts reflect spontaneous order in society, how texts are produced spontaneously, how texts are subject to spontaneous order in society. So I think there's a lot of places to go with
Although it's
that.
funny you mentioned the boom-bust cycle. I mean, one of Cantor's first big project on this dealt with the German hyperinflation.
That's true. That's the one on Thomas Mann, right?
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, that's his essay on Thomas Mann.
So who are some other writers you're looking at right now?
Well, I'm looking at E.M. Forster. I'm looking at a particular writer who is virtually undiscovered. He's sort of a Southern literature figure. His name is John William Corrington, and he is most known for authoring the screenplay for Battle for the Planet of the Apes while he was still a law student, actually. And fascinating figure. I like him. He's a PhD in English and a lawyer, so I'm sort of naturally drawn to this character, and he reminds me a lot of myself, but he's more of a brawler type than I am, and certainly more of an outrageous figure than I am. I'm sort of quiet, go about my own business kind of guy, and he was louder than I think I am. But fascinating figure. I'm working with him. I've worked with Jefferson quite a bit and Jefferson's theories of natural law.
I thought you were going to reveal to us the economic meaning behind Battle of the Planet of the Apes or whatever. No, that's not. You haven't,
no, I haven't. I haven't gone there. My focus.
When you find it, please.
Absolutely.
Let us know. It sounds like a great Mises Daily article.
Yeah, that's true. It would be. I'll have to look into that. I haven't even thought about that until now. So that's funny.
As I think back to the Austrian tradition, and I talk about this all the time, but one of the odd things is that Henry Hazlitt himself started off as a literary critic. I mean, he was a literary editor at The Nation magazine of all places. So, I mean, we have even in the biography of some of our heroes, we have some relationship there.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because there's a certain bias that you can see in literary studies just by the fact that people like Isabel Patterson, Ayn Rand, they're not actually studied in literature departments, or if they're studied, they're certainly pushed way to the margins. Yeah. And these are enormous figures in the history of
well,
literature.
They are. I mean, Rand was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, a woman, she comes over here as really a young girl with no formal education in the United States and very limited in Russia. And I mean, she's got to be one of the most important cultural figures of the 20th century.
I think Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead are both within the top 10 bestsellers of all time, and I would even guess that they're in the top 6 of all time.
How can literature departments continue to ignore this? I don't get that.
Well, I think I don't have the answer to the question, but I do have a guess, and that's that I think that because Marxism is virtually a monopoly among economic study of literary texts and so on, that people come to the word capitalism with a complex web of associations that don't necessarily relate to the way you or I would think of the word capitalism. I mean, a lot of literary scholars hear the word capitalism and they think state-based capitalism, crony capitalism, collusion,
everything evil,
everything evil, and everything that pure free market economics is working against. Yeah. And so that's what I think. I think that a lot of literary scholars, if they really truly understood the economic arguments, or if they at least entertained them, I should say, because they would understand them if they did know of them. But I think that the problem is that there's just not an exposure. But I think if the exposure were there, they would find that we are working toward common ground here.
Right.
the goal is to make conditions better for everybody. There's no hidden agenda to try to make the world worse for everybody.
Right. Well, and you can look at essays like Hans Hoppe's essay on Marxism that appeared in his book on property, I believe. And he says that there's aspects of Marxism that are worth rescuing, precisely because they have their origin in a kind of a classical liberal paradigm, and in particular this notion of seeking out the conflicts in society. You know, that to some extent society is, as we know it, rife with conflicts, but the conflict is not between capital and labor or the workers and whatever,
et cetera.
But essentially between the individual and the state. So
right.
That's
now
my impression is that now I think Cantor and Cox crafted this book to sell a new paradigm in some ways to literature departments, to literary critics, and my impression is that it's had some success so far. Is that yours too?
It's definitely had some success. I can think of a few people off the top of my head who have read the book and become interested in Austrian economic theory. Maybe wouldn't just jump right into it, but at least they've been exposed to it. And I can think of some. I blog with Troy Camplin, for instance, and he started a blog, Austrian Economics and Literature, and it gets a lot of hits, and it's generated a lot of interest. So the interest is there, or is potentially there. It's just people need to be aware of
It's new.
It's new.
Yeah, it's new. But you would have no problem taking this book and giving it to your professor and saying, "Look, this is a fascinating book. Have a look."
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would
So
absolutely do that.
that's quite something, actually, to be able to say that about a book. I mean, it's pioneering in that way. And I think oftentimes, and I think you and I were talking about this casually the other day in the library, that we forget just how pervasive socialist economic thought is in departments outside of economics. In fact, in most universities, most of the good sense comes out of the economics departments, and that the problems are really elsewhere.
Right.
The biggest problems are really elsewhere.
And I can certainly testify that, being someone who was an undergraduate literature major and then came to law school and took law school classes before I ever took my MA English courses, and realized I had quite a bit to catch up on because I had not learned a lot of stuff. So I think that you're exactly right. I think that it's just limited exposure is a huge issue.
But it's unfortunate, isn't it, that economics is so relegated to the small area of the of academic life. You know, I mean, Mises himself believed that economics has so much to teach us that is applicable to a huge range of disciplines.
Sure, absolutely, and I'm not sure I can even add to that statement. I think that's perfectly right, and I think that especially given the attention to texts as commodities. How could you not at least consider capitalist theories? Why should Marxism enjoy an exclusive right over that theory and that practice?
Now, do you have a dissertation topic picked out yet?
Tentatively. I'm tracing the idea of natural law through 19th century America, and looking at literary texts and the way they both reflect and inform different ideas of natural law.
That's a big topic.
It's a big topic, and I do think that if more judges would read literary theory, we may not have less problems with interpreting statutes and case precedent, et cetera, but we would at least have better, sounder approaches to those readings.
Now, have you pitched the topic yet to your committee, or do you have a
No, I have not. So I've still got some time to work on that. I haven't even gone through my oral exams and my preliminary exams.
And then after you finish, and it's off to academia for you.
That's the goal.
Okay, and more writing.
More writing, certainly more writing. Always writing.
What does Cantor say about your ambitions? Is he thrilled?
He's he's cautious. I think he's excited. I think he wants me to know that realize what I'm in for and what I'm up against. But I think that he's happy at the end of the day.
I mean, just in conclusion here, just to reflect, because I'm mystified and thrilled by attempting to trace the progress of ideas through the generations. I mean, we have Mises as a very young man. I mean, a teenager, Cantor stumbles into a
17,
seminar.
I think,
Yeah.
is
And fell in love with economics and studied it and studied and studied. Of course, Cantor's absolutely brilliant, but he pursued literature. So now, and he's getting up in years, I suppose. But but he himself has forged this new paradigm, and he's passing it on to another generation. So it's very exciting to see.
It is exciting. It is very
After
exciting.
all these years, something being fleshed out like this and becoming a real body of thought. And it does sometimes take generations, doesn't it?
That's right. It does, and it requires, it requires overcoming hurdles and boundaries. But I think commitment to the ideas and being able to articulate the ideas in a good way goes a long way towards validating the ideas. In other words, the message speaks for itself.
Yes.
I should
well,
say.
and you begin to feel an enthusiasm for the ideas.
Sure.
And then you pick them up and
Yeah.
run with them. So we're looking forward to seeing what you will do in the
Well,
future.
thank you very much.
And I
Thank
look
you so
forward to
much.
having you on again.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you invited me, and I appreciate it. It was a good time.